Right, introducing on my next special guest now, where we're in for a treat. We've got Neil Taylor on my show. Welcome, Neil Taylor. Great to have you on board.
Well, thanks for having me on, Danny.
It's amazing to have you on board. Having read your discography and your life story, you've been pretty much a pretty busy bee, haven't you?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I suppose if you average it all out, probably not. But, but I mean, yeah. I mean, I've been a professional guitar player for many many years now,
Wonderful.
and yeah, and it's there's lots of lows and a few highs.
Of course.
That's what it's like.
Yep. I just throwing it back to the start. Were you based like in the southwest? Like Bath way, Bristol.
Yeah, I originally grew up in Bristol.
Lovely.
And then when I started like getting together with Tears for Fears, I moved over to Bath when I was about 24 years old, and I've stayed in the area ever since. Now living in a place called Bradford on Avon, which is about 6, 7 miles away from Bath.
Sounds very nice. How was Bath in the 80s? Was it as quaint as it is to this very day, the historical town and everything?
Yeah, I mean it was much easier to park then. That's one thing I miss about going in. Well, I really miss not being able to park so easy in Bath. But yeah, I mean, there were back then, back in the late 70s, early 80s, uh, there were many more venues for smaller bands, and yeah, it's quite a circuit all over the southwest, like in Bristol, especially.
Mm, mm.
And Bath, and of course we've just lost the Moles Club, but it was been amazing for many many years. Oasis played there, and that's all gone now.
Ah, sad. Just throwing it back
Yeah.
to the TFF days. I know back in the days, was it Snow Hill Flats that they used to hang around in Bath? Um, I
Um,
heard in an
y-
interview once.
y- yeah. Kurt was from Snow Hill. And yeah, he lived in a kind of high rise, I think, with his parents and his brothers. But I never went to that place. I mean, when I first working with Cheers, I mean, I think he was living in, where was he? Lansdowne Crescent, I think.
Mm, mm. Was it around 1983 you started like working professionally as a musician? Then around that time.
Yeah, I mean, I became professional when I was about 24 years old. So 23, 24. So yeah, it was around that period because my first professional thing I did really was going on tour with Tears for Fears. And I think that was 1983,
Mm,
actually, thinking about it.
mm.
And that was called the Going Far, Getting Nowhere tour. They just released a single called Going Far, Getting Nowhere. So they did a month all around the UK, and they wanted another guitar player. And because I'd played with Kurt in a band called Neon in Bath, they said, well, let's get Neil in. And I bumped into Kurt at a party, and he said, we've been trying to find you because we want you to play with us on the road.
Mm.
And so I ended up rehearsing with them, and we went on the road. I mean, it was the most amazing thing I'd ever done. I've played lots of shows before, but like small venues, but playing these big venues and stuff, it was like, wow, I've really hit the big time here.
Yeah,
That was
yeah.
my kind of initial thought.
Yeah, Kurt was very famous for his trademark long and braided hair, wasn't he, back then? He had his own style.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, and I remember there's a video of the Hammersmith gig called "In My Mind's Eye," and I'm kind of in a string vest with a little ponytail that I put in with a elastic band, um, dancing very funny. But yeah, it was a great time because when I left school, I went to work with my dad as a builder. So being doing something like that, being pulled away from that and going on tour with a band that had just kind of like had a few hits.
Mm.
I mean, it was like full of screaming girls, which was kind of weird,
Yeah.
going from like being a labourer to playing in like 3, 4 thousand venues.
Mm. Do you remember as if it was only yesterday then, those days?
Some of it, yeah, I do, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it was a great time for me, very exciting. Um,
Fascinating.
yeah, and being on tour, and I just wanted to stay on tour the whole time. Things have changed a little bit now. As I've got older, I don't want to be on tour really very much anymore.
Mm. And Neon as well. They split to form. Was it Naked Eyes? They had like
That's right. Yeah,
a top 75
that's
hit with
right.
Always Something There to remind me.
Yeah, that's right. They actually, when they were called Neon, it was Rob Fisher and Pete Byrne. They came to see me play with my band Sneak Preview at a place in Bath called the Western. And when they came up to me after and said, "We want you to do a session for us," and I played on one of their songs. It was called Communication Without Sound, and in Crescent Studios in Bath. And Kurt was playing bass on it. That's how I met Kurt, and that's how I got the gig with Tears for Fears.
Incredible.
Um, yeah, and
And
the first ever proper session I did, apart from the Neon session, was at Ian Stanley's house in Bath when they were recording songs from the Big Chair. I went up one evening, they called me and said, "We have a song we want you to play on. Can you come up?" I said, "Well, yeah, when do you want me up?" I said, "Can you come up now?" So I got in the car and went up, and all they had was a backing track. They had a groove, and it was down, down, do, 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 down, down. So we don't know where we're going with this yet, but we know we want a guitar solo. And Roland had the guitar sound set up, so I just ended up playing. I did two takes, and they used the first half of the first one and the second half the second one, or the other way around. I can't remember, and that was it.
mm,
And I got paid £200. I was like, wow, this is amazing.
and Songs from the Big Chair was the album that broke America, the follow up to the Hurting
Yeah.
album. The Hurting, remember the child with his head in his hands. Do you think that the sounds on the Songs from the Big Chair much different from the debut album?
Yeah, I can't. I had nothing to do with the first album. Um, I did listen to it quite a lot, and because we did quite a few tracks from that first album on the tour, but that was the kind of period when they were into their kind of primal therapy kind of thing. It
Hmm.
was it was all a bit kind of a bit weird to me at the
Mm,
time. I didn't quite
yeah.
get it. But yeah, and then Songs from the Big Chair was a kind. I think it was a kind of continuation from that as well.
Mm. And you played the solo one that Everybody Wants to Rule the World, and
That's right. Yeah, that I forgot to mention that down down I was talking about was the Everybody Wants to Rule the World solo, and yeah, and that was one of my first sessions, and then I kind of carried on from that and worked with lots of other people
mm.
since, you know.
And did you play a part in the Broken Down track as well on the album as well?
Oh, Broken, yeah. I played the guitar solo on that as well.
And yeah.
That that was an actual the gig we did at the Hammersmith Odeon. They recorded it for a video, but there was something wrong with the guitar sound. There was something wrong with the connection, and they said, "We want you to play exactly that solo you did that night on the album." So they gave me a cassette so I could go away and learn it, because I used to play something different every night on that song, Broken, when they were trying it out before they recorded it. So that solo was just from the night of the Hammersmith Odeon. I happened to play that night, and I just learnt it and played it on the studio version. They were very much into kind of Robert Fripp, and it's kind of a Frippish kind of solo.
Mm. One of my favourite standout tracks, of course, Everybody Wants to Rule the World. I Believe as well. That's a great song, isn't it, on that album?
Oh, that is a great song. Yeah, I mean, Songs from the Big Chair is
Mm,
iconic.
mm,
It's the most amazing album. Yeah, I mean, but one of my favourite Tears for Fears tracks, not because I played on it, was but everybody, not everybody. That is one of my favourite tracks, but also "Woman in Chains."
mm, mm. That's off the Seeds of Love album.
That's right. Yeah,
And did you work with a lady called Alita Adams who had, of course, went on to have success with Get Here?
yeah, I did, and I ended up playing on her album as well, on a
Amazing.
song. What was it? The song called When Will We Ever Learn? I think it's called, or When Will We Learn? I can't remember.
What a voice she has.
Oh, she had an amazing voice. Yeah,
Mm,
absolutely amazing. Of course, she came on tour with us on the Sown the Seeds of Love tour in 1990.
And people can see all the footage on, let's say, YouTube still of the tour.
Yes, yeah. I mean, there's a gig we did. I think it was called "Going to California," and yeah. I mean that was the only gig that was actually filmed for the whole tour, which was a bit sad. I mean, that was obviously before the time of mobile phones and stuff.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, I mean, it's a great video, and it was all played live,
Mm.
and yeah, I mean, that was a great gig to do,
Mm.
to be honest, with all
Just
the musicians and stuff.
amazing. I mean, there's so much to talk about. Looking at your CV, you've worked with Holly Johnson, and then
Yep,
you worked with Tina Turner. How was that experience?
that was amazing. I'd funny enough, I'd been working with Holly Johnson, and Dan Hartman was the producer on Holly's second album. I think it was called what's it called? Oh God, I can't remember now. But anyway, Automatic? No, not anyway. It was on his second album. You can look that up. But and Dan was producing his second album, and then and I was playing guitar because I played on Holly's first album, and Holly wanted me to come back in. And then a few weeks after meeting Dan and playing on his on Holly's second album, um, I had a call from Dan Hartman saying, "Neil, could you come up to London tomorrow? I've got a session for you." And I said, "Yeah, okay. Who's it for?" He said, "Oh, it's Tina Turner." And the first thing I wanted to do is like say no. I thought I can't go and play with Tina Turner. That's like that's too good. I kind of felt like, oh God, I can't do that. Play with Tina Turner. That's way above my pay grade. Anyway, so I went up and I was kind of nervous all the way up. I was getting, butterflies in my stomach. And by the time I got there, I kind of convinced myself that, well, Neil, the artist is never in the studio anyway, a lot of the time. They'll just come in and sing and let the producer do the rest. And so I go in there with my amp in a bag over my guitar over my shoulder and an amp in my other hand and walk into the studio, push the door open, and it was Tina Turner. And that was kind of weird. I mean, there was like so many people in there. I kind of thinking it was just going to be the producer and a tape op,
Mm.
but it wasn't. Producer, engineer, and a tape op. But there was like a PA, a manager, and it's kind of a daunting thing when you have to stand there
Mm.
and come up with the goods, really. And I always kind of always had a bit of a problem with that, to be
Mm.
honest. And but in the end, something takes over, and you think, well, I'm here now. I have to do it, so let's go for it. And I ended up coming up. I ended up coming up with this riff, and she loved it, and she was like dancing all over the studio, and she pulled my guitar lead out of my guitar at one point. She said, "I'm so sorry, but I'm so excited. It's exactly what I wanted." And that was a song called "Steamy Windows." There's a kind of driving guitar part that goes the whole way through it,
That's
and
amazing.
that yeah. So that was amazing to have done that.
And that's off an album Foreign Affair that was released in 1989. That will take you up to. Um, and was it, as you say, an overawing experience, overwhelming that day?
Yeah. I mean, it was still quite overwhelming, and I kind of always thought, oh, it's I'm not good enough for this. I'm not good enough because I was mainly self-taught, so that's always kind of in me. It's like, oh, but see, the thing was, I'm mainly self-taught, and I've never really went to that many guitar lessons, and I've always been a kind of more of a field player, and people used to get me in for what I could add to the song. But if someone puts a chord chart in front of me, I just freeze. I thought, oh no, it's like going back to school. And I can't read a chord chart properly at all. And if I get a weird chord going on, A over C or whatever, what the hell is that?
And taking you to the end of the 80s into the 90s now, Morrissey as well. What a character. That must have been an amazing experience to work with the last of the famous international playboys.
Yes, yeah. I mean that that was an amazing kind of a time. I got a call from the his A&R guy, a guy called Nick Gatfield, and said, "Would you be interested in working with Morrissey?" And funny enough, I'd a few weeks before I'd bought Strange Ways Here We Come, and I'd been listening to it, and so he said, "Okay, well, I'm going to get the producer to give you a call." So the producer gave me a call about 10 minutes later, and he started asking me all these questions like, "What kind of guitar do you play?" I said, "Well, I got a Strat and a Les Paul." And he said, "No, no, no." He said, "I mean, what kind of guitarist are you?" He said, "You're not one of I always remember him saying, "You're not one of these guys that riffs up and down the neck, are you?" I said, "Listen, I know what Morrissey and the Smiths are about. So, you have no worries there." And he said, "What's your record collection?" And it was like, what's that to do with it?
Mm.
Um, and then he said, "Right, okay, so I know you're a session guitar player." He said, "But Morrissey won't like that. So don't tell him you're a session guitar player." So it was like, "Well, what do I tell him then?" He said, "Well, you can mention Tears for Fears, but don't mention bands like Climby Fisher or anybody like that." So the first night we're at the studio, and we're having dinner, and we're all sat around and no one's saying a word. And Morris is at the end of the table, like on the sat in his chair, like tapping his knife or fork on the table, and no one's talking, just like looking down and eating. And he looks at me and said, "So, Neil," and what I hadn't played a note at this point. And he said, "So, Neil, what have you done then? Why, almost like, why are you here?" And I said, "Well, I work with Tears for Fears." "Oh, you're in the band, are you?" I said, "Well, not completely." He said, "So do you play with other bands?" And the producer was looking at me and he's like, much as say, "Don't say anything." And I said, "Well, no, I mainly work with Tears for Fears." "Oh, right, okay." And then he said to me, "So what was your main influence in becoming a musician?" And at this point, I thought, I've had enough of all this, and I just said, "Right, I'm going to tell him." And I thought, the next thing I'm going to be told by the producer, "Oh, you got to go. You didn't like what you said." But I said to him, "Okay, well, it was Mark Bolan and T Rex." I thought, "Oh, here we go." And he said, "Mine too." So we went in the other room, and he'd brought a few T Rex albums. So we kind of bonded a little bit, listening to a bit of T Rex. Um, so that was kind of a weird time,
Yeah.
but quite a nice thing
Yeah.
to be able to say that I've worked with Morrissey.
Mm. And there you have it, the last of the famous international playboys.
Yeah, yeah,
Cool.
that's right.